Welcome to The Laws of Style, featuring conversations on creativity, fashion, and the law from the leading edge of our economy and culture. Hosted by noted fashion lawyer Douglas Hand.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast, The Laws of Style. Downloading to you from high above Bryant Park in the Fashion District of New York. I'm your host, Douglas Hand, fashion lawyer and fashion law professor. I'm joined by Melissa Joy Manning, who is both a jewelry designer and a sustainability activist, I'll say. But we can deep dive into that as the questions plumb further. So welcome.
Thank you.
So I guess just for our listeners that may not be familiar with the line, tell us how you got into jewelry design and a little bit about the brand story.
Okay. I've actually always made jewelry. Like lots of kids, it started in Montessori school, but I kind of just never stopped. In high school, I was making and selling things and just always creating consumer pieces, hair pieces, pins. But my parents are classic overachievers and were like, art isn't something you should do. So I actually tried to study law and ended up withdrawing from classes and found traditional metalsmithing in Mexico.
So was this after high school, or was this your
After,
undergraduate
yeah,
years?
Undergraduate years. I was at
Okay.
UC San Diego, trying really hard to fit that mold
Yeah.
in a sorority, all those things,
La
because my
Jolla.
mom was. Oh, God, yeah, La Jolla.
Pre-law in La Jolla.
Oh, yeah.
Hard.
It was challenging.
Yeah.
So I ended up, disappearing into Mexico, and which has always resonated with me, a place
But
I
not
love.
in the really bad way that sometimes people do these days.
No,
Yeah.
more in, no. There were no, so I ended up studying at the Instituto de San Miguel de Allende, traditional
Okay.
metalsmithing, and I just loved it. And when I came back to the States, San Francisco State still had a public arts program.
Okay.
I was lucky enough to go there, and I studied jewelry and sculpture, actually, so academically trained. But then when I graduated, there were no opportunities. It was post-NAFTA, height of NAFTA, so all skilled trade jobs were offshore.
Okay.
And I couldn't really find anything, but I've always loved to sell, so I was in high-end retail. But I got
In what brands?
I was at Wilkes Bashford,
Okay.
and some other smaller boutiques in San Francisco, and restaurant work.
Okay.
But the parents weren't super happy with that trajectory. What are we going to do?
She's not in Big Law. She's showing people
No.
to tables and taking reservations.
Yeah, and it was just kind of like, I went to a vocation. My mom sent me to a vocational counselor. My mom's a lawyer.
Okay.
And I sat down at this table and took all these tests, and the results came back I should be self-employed, which kind of isn't a surprise with my personality type. And they said, what can you do? And I said, I can make jewelry. And Betty said, that was the counselor's name, said, well, there you go. Be a jewelry designer. And I had no idea what that meant. My walls were plastered with L. When everybody was, Ben Simon, all that beautiful fashion. I've always loved it. But I had no idea how to start my business. So I went to the Renaissance Entrepreneurship Center in San Francisco, which is a business kind of incubator for women and minorities. You have to have a viable business idea to be accepted.
Okay.
I went there and got a boot camp of business, and then started my own brand with $500 at 26 by walking around to stores I liked and asking them to carry my work.
Wow.
Fast forward 22 years later, and basically still doing the same thing.
Well, let's put a pin in San Miguel, because I
Yeah.
would love to hear about what it was like back then.
No, it
Not
was
that
so
it's
much fun.
changed drastically, but it's
Yeah.
just much more populated by people who may not live there all year round.
Right.
But let's talk about your design process.
Mm-hmm.
Has it always been the same? Has it evolved? You've obviously trained under masters, and you've seen a lot of different, jewelry is one of those items. You can go to a large jeweler and really almost span the globe of influences from Greek and Egyptian to Central American influences in design. How did your design process evolve, and do you feel that it continually evolves? Does it change season to season for you still?
I mean, for me, it's interesting. I had this conversation yesterday with someone about design. Like, we were actually in a brand exercise, and it was kind of like, how do you design? And most people I know sketch, they do inspiration boards. I just kind of walk around thinking about things. I'm really inspired by everything I see around me, people, environment. And it's just this kind of like visual processing where things just begin to coalesce in jewelry in my head until it becomes to a point where I just need to get it out. So there's usually very little sketching. It's just pen to paper, drawing patterns, and then those patterns get translated into work. Sometimes, a lot of times when I do color stories, so I tend to divide my work into 3 categories, and the color story work, which ends up to be a lot of my one-of-a-kind bigger pieces, are about the stones. And it's, I'm from Berkeley, and I've always hated this idea that, oh, you're this hippie from Northern California, especially when Birkenstocks were in style, I would just not touch them. And it's just kind of like, but I do feel like the stones kind of tell me what they want to be. For me, the work is really just about allowing the beauty of nature to come through. So it doesn't need a lot of design. It doesn't need a lot of fussiness, simplicity for me in terms of just giving them somewhere to shine so people enjoy them and give them a new life. The how I design, though, the language of it, for lack of a better word, does change season to season sometimes in terms of, the architecture of the piece, the engineering of the piece. My language tends to be really round because I'm a chain maker in general, but this season threw in a lot of straight lines. So I think as a designer, you always want to change and evolve because that's what's inspiring.
So it's jewelry. It's not tabletop. It's not, you haven't really branched out into, nor, jewelry is obviously the most intimate use of the precious stone and the metals. Have you ever done, beyond the traditional body parts of the neck, the ears, the wrist, the fingers, have you done, I know I have a few tie pins of yours, which unfortunately I'm not wearing one today because I have
Shame
a vest
on
on.
you.
No, you should never wear a vest and a tie pin.
Laws of style.
Laws of style,
Right.
Exactly. But have you branched out into other body areas, or do other body areas excite you from a design perspective that might not be obvious?
I mean, who's now absolutely one of my best friends, Duri Chung, when she had her label Duri, we worked together on a really interesting collaboration for Runway, where I was doing these big metal gloves and like pieces, like worn pieces that were more kind of a nod to chainmail but modern armor. So I have done things like that for specific projects. I mean, it's interesting conceptually to me. What I'm more interested in is taking jewelry. Sometimes you referenced it a little bit. Is for me like going back to my sculptural roots. So I've done some sculptural installations using jewelry components, which I really enjoy and I would like to do more of. That might be a future endeavor that I'm thinking of considering. But I really like the fusion of the two, of how I can, because a lot of times how I design is I design big and then I scale down. So it's kind of like if I could just, cover your wall with something, I'd be really happy.
And
about
is that
too.
because technically that affords you the opportunity to really kind of get into the weeds of how, if it's a gemstone, how it's going to be affixed and how it's going to look, and then as you reduce the size and the scale, you kind of have that master plan? It's like your master blueprint, or is it just you think big and then you realize commercially it can't be that big?
Right. Yeah. I think it's just creativity. Like I like just putting together big things, and I love playing like almost like puzzle pieces, like putting all the stones together so I'll end up with a really big collar or a giant cuff. And then it's like taking that color story and diffusing it down into the most wearable pieces, because the majority of what people buy is pretty simple. So it's like you've got this one big press piece or archival piece, and then you've got all these, and then sometimes they sell, and I've been known to cry about it. Like, really, you're gonna take this one from me?
Right.
But
well, for our listeners that may not know the distinctions, your jewelry is considered fine jewelry. What are there other levels, and sort of at the bottom end there would be costume jewelry. Is there a tween region, and what does fine mean versus costume?
so there is a tween region, which is called demi-fine. It used to be called Bridge, but I think they call it demi-fine now. I sometimes wonder if I'm more demi-fine than fine because I don't use 18 karat all the time, and I don't use super precious gemstones all the time.
Okay.
I think that the difference is materials and workmanship. So the crafting of fine jewelry is usually done, like what you said, by a master. So someone who's very well trained, very well paid, because they have to have the ability to engineer and create these pieces. And then the kind of consumer goods that are more easily attained that you see on, what they call TOC, top of counter rotating displays that are costume, those are synthetic materials that aren't natural. And they tend to be made in mass market consumer spaces, maybe offshore somewhere.
Yeah.
In places that don't treat people as well sometimes. So,
And the relative price points. I mean, obviously, fine can get into the stratosphere, but typical. If I'm walking into Bergdorf's or Barney's and I'm looking between fine and costume, what's the price differential there typically?
I mean, it really depends, because there are fashion costume designers now who do generate a lot of desire for their work, so they can be up to $500-$700 for something that's not a completely natural material. But I mean, my line, for example, we have an accessible price point, so we start at like $100, and then when we go up from there. So the majority, I think, of demi-fine or bridge fine sits, average price point $500 to $1,000, and then fine is way up there,
Yeah.
white glove service.
Right. So you are the co-chair of the CFDA's Sustainability Committee, and you're an advisory board member of the Lexus CFDA Fashion Positive. You've also been quoted as saying, being mindful of our impact is rooted in your brand's design philosophy. We seek to redefine what precious means and to create pieces that are unique to the wearer instead of contributing to a culture of disposable fashion. Talk to me about the MJM ethos around sustainability.
Well, it goes back to my brand inception. So it really was core principle to the creation of my company. I spoke earlier that when I started, there were no jobs available for me as a trained jeweler. Most things were being made offshore. I think there was a very small handful of jewelry designers at the time who were making things in the United States. And when I sat down in the business program with, advisors and mentors who always have a lot to say, they always told me I would never be competitive if I made things onshore. The majority of the industry, in order to be competitive, you have to make it where they make it. And I just didn't buy it. I just really felt like, for me, I really wanted to create a community with my company so I could offer other artists living, working wage plus full benefits, health, vision, dental, disability, life, and create this space where people who were artists could work and enjoy working together. And that's what we did. So as I started growing and hiring people, I just kept my production in-house and controlling that. And, when I realized that there was room, especially in fine jewelry, to do that in terms of pricing and remaining competitive, that's when I started looking at the environmental focus of what I was doing, and then became committed to using only 100% recycled metal that is only refined in the United States in another certified green studio, actually certified green refinery out of Virginia. And then when I was like, oh, you're certified green, what does that mean? And then figure out we could be certified green in the state of California, which is actually a very rigorous process.
So what is that process and what does that mean?
Yeah, so we just re-upped it. So we were one of the first people when they first did it, like 5-6 years ago, and then we had to redo it, become recertified, and it's this huge list, and you have to have like 60 to 70 points on it in order to be certified. So it's everything from water usage, chemical usage, electrical usage, the amount of post-consumer recycled products you use in your back office operations, including pens, papers, carbon offsetting your shipping, our material usage, our zero waste philosophy, to even like now we have bike repair kits available for employees who ride bikes to work. So it's encouraging mass transit instead of
And that gives you points.
points.
And it's an objective standard based on those points.
And then you come out at the end. And so it's like some things you can't do, right? So because we can't be LEED certified. I can't redo our building, but we can do all these other things. So, and then part of it is, the messaging. So we talk about it so that other people think like, hey, maybe I can do it too. And then we, so part of the requirement is referring people and then having those friends go through the process and become green certified as well.
Do you feel that it also has a market impact at all with consumers? That
I think it does now. I mean, back when I first started talking about this, it was crickets. I mean, my first day as a CFDA member, I stood up and asked Stephen and Diane what our industry's plans for sustainability were, and the room was dead silent, and I like turned bright red, and they looked at each other and were like, none. And I sat down, and to their credit, it's now one of their pillars.
Yeah.
So it's definitely changed, which is amazing. But most people didn't want to talk about it. At trunk shows, I would try to talk to consumers about it, but they're getting in their car and they drive home. And unfortunately, we live in this culture where we're defining people by what they do wrong rather than what they do right. And so we can't, it's hard, it's challenging to gain a momentum and have a positive conversation about it.
Right.
But I think that that's starting to happen. So that's really exciting. So from a consumer perspective, I think it is important, especially with transparency and culture and the millennials really wanting to find something that they believe in, buy into, and be part of a story that resonates. So I think responsibility is starting to become a purchasing point.
Mm-hmm.
But design always comes first. It's always about the design.
And sometimes price.
And price,
obviously.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
One of the things that jewelry stands apart in to a degree from apparel is certainly for fine jewelry, most of those pieces are going to be kept.
Correct.
And handed down, put in a will if someone is keeping a will. And that makes the product category inherently friendly to the environment in the sense that there's a lot of supply out there which is just changing hands through legacy.
Correct. But there are a lot of people who sell that or don't use it anymore. So, but it is different than apparel for that, for sure.
But I'd like to, and I hear that a lot, and it makes sense. Also, the luxury price point. I mean, even with apparel, if you're talking about a $4,000 garment, well, that's probably going to be passed down too. But most apparel is in the price range of $15 to $30, right? And those things are not going to be passed on unless they're repurposed in some way. Usually, they may not last past one wearer. But in the jewelry industry, and I'm fine and costume and bridge, are there examples of wastefulness, and what are those? And here I'm speaking environmentally.
Oh, I mean, yeah, jewelry's really dirty. I mean, it's really dirty. And that's part of my challenge and part of why my business has changed so dramatically over the last couple of years is really facing that, right? So being this idealist of like, I want to leave the world a better place for my existence. I want my child to live in a world that was similar to mine where, when you drove down the street, bugs were on your windshield. Where'd all the bugs go? Like, they're gone, right? So it's like, how do I reconcile my desire with what I do? And jewelry is inherently dirty. There's now the option for fair trade gold, but some of the standards aren't necessarily the same across a lot of different platforms. So I'm still most comfortable with recycled gold, but then there's the argument where it only has to be recycled once. Where did it come from the first time? Because mining is, for lack of a better word, a minefield, right? So they pour chemicals into the ground. People are treated horribly. And I mean, that's mining for stones and for metal. So it's just kind of like the more you learn, the more you're like, oh my God, what am I complicit in? And we're all complicit. Every single one of us is. So it's just kind of in a supply-demand economy, how do we start demanding better supplies so that we can change the ability we have better choices? So for me, that's really changed, a lot of the stones I use, a lot, how much I how much jewelry I actually physically want to make. Because it is really dirty. You know, everyone remembers the word, you know, that movie Blood Diamond.
Right.
And, you know, they came up with a Kimberly process to certify the stones that they weren't coming from that space. But it's really easy to get those across country lines. And it is a real challenge, you know. And the United States tried to do something about the money laundering issue with gold. So they did the Frank-Dodd Act. And there's murmurings that there's going to start doing something with stones, because a lot of the stone supply are controlled by sometimes terrorist organizations or come out of specific regions of the world where they're supplying, they're using the money to buy arms. So there's a lot of geopolitical as well as environmental aspects from the raw materials in jewelry.
Yeah. Well, you hit on something as well about being an independent brand and being able to make what you want in the way that you want to make it, which I think resonates here, where you may lose margin by doing what you're doing. You do lose margin.
I do. I absolutely do.
You may gain some customers, but it could be we're still at an imbalance where you're not gaining enough customers to justify, in a cold, rational, financial sense, the margin loss.
Absolutely. It's an uphill battle.
Right. But do you... I guess here I want to applaud that, and I guess say that did you ever feel pressure earlier on, or do you still now, to transform the brand into something that could be $1 billion brand, a lifestyle brand, or are you content? I don't want to lead you to the answer. The answer is the answer, but content to have a business which is sustainable both from as much as you can in an environmental perspective, but also financially, that it's making a profit, and it may not be a profit that's going to allow it to IPO, but one that is going to allow you to raise a family and live a life in the way that you want to live it.
Right. So that's a really interesting question. And for me, the space within sustainability and speaking about that has really morphed into this as well. We're conditioned as Americans to always want to be bigger and better and grow and post bottom lines and make money. I mean, look at the game Life, right? I used to play that game all the time when I was little, and I figured out how to spin it just right. So I always landed on doctor. So I got the biggest paycheck, got the 4 kids, drove the car to the end, and you win life, right? We're conditioned everywhere we look that we are defined by how much money we make, and that's awful. To me, that's not true. It's not true love. It's not true life. It's not who we are as people, is to just amass stuff. But I was conditioned that way, and I'm not going to lie or try to say I wasn't. I used to really want that. I used to think that I wanted this brand that was, everywhere, and you could see it in all the stores. And I chased that for a while, and that was my ego. It was my ego wanting this kind of sense of satisfaction.
And to be fair to you, perhaps your education. I mean, you were educated here.
Yeah.
And that is, from an early age, what you're reading about in the history books, and you know, the way that certainly when you get into your undergrad years and your professional studies, that's winning the game. I mean, that's the goal of the educator as well, is to get you to that place where you are doing well financially.
Right. And I just kind of started questioning that around the birth of my son and around the closing of my flagship 12 Wooster. And just, I'd sat in on all these meetings with the CFDA and with a lot of advisors, and I'd actually gone to them with this idea of an exit plan, because for me it was really challenging to reconcile, like I've said, a lot of the things in this conversation. And it was kind of this, well, you shouldn't just leave, you need to build the brand, sell it, and exit. And it was like, all right, okay, let's think about that. And then started talking to an investor and started getting all of these. I think at one time I even asked you your opinion on one of these investor plans, and just really started thinking about it. And I was like, these are just modern pyramid schemes, right? It's just one person coming in, putting a lot of money in, saying all of a sudden your company's bigger, and then the next schmuck's going to buy it, and then the next one. And then you just have to keep churning out stuff, but none of it's real.
Yeah, we had some version of this conversation at that time too.
Yeah, probably. I was probably already thinking about it. So I just kind of really looked at that and thought about it also too from the sustainability perspective. What was I going to be making, and was it meaningful? And what were my resources going to be, and how much was I going to consume? And really, if I'm going to start reporting just on bottom line numbers, that means I have to make concessions on how I treat people, how I pay people, the choices I make as a designer in my raw materials. And I just couldn't do it. And it just became part of my philosophy as I just backed away. I mean, I voluntarily last year went from 250 accounts worldwide to less than 100. And I just really focused on making better product, stronger relationships, and focusing more on my own retail, and telling our story in a way that made sense and resonated to our consumers, and was able to change the focus of the brand where, we're a successful company, but I don't know how much more I need. Like, I think what I need and what success means to me is I get to live my life the way I choose to. I get to wake up in the morning, spend time with my son before I get to go make jewelry. The fact that people buy anything that comes out of my head, I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Yeah. So I don't need more than that. I'd like to pay for my child's education. I'd like to travel because that's where I derive so much of my inspiration. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if I don't think I need my name everywhere. I don't need to grow this huge brand.
Well, and you're being modest because 100 accounts, and you have 2 brick and mortar stores, one still in Berkeley, California,
my hippie
and
roots.
One now in Cobble Hill,
Uh-huh.
Having closed the Soho flagship. That's a bi-coastal and international business
It is.
That you're well known for.
Well, I've done it for 22 years, though.
Yeah.
I mean, pre-internet even. So.
Well, and so let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What was it like as that was transforming the business, transforming the industry? And do you feel that there was a boat missed there, or that a bullet dodged there, that you're not this massive brand that is now, has a whole costume arm because you have to, because you've got a huge e-com presence?
I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting thing. I've always loved technology, right? But not being a baby of it. When I grew up, I didn't have a computer. It was like, typing on a word processor.
You had that.
I
had the 3-ring,
Totally. I mean, word processor was very end of school. Like
Wang.
Yeah.
Did you have a Wang?
No,
Wang
I think it was HP.
Okay.
Yeah. My first computer was like this deep, right?
Yeah.
I remember my dad had a cell phone.
Floppy disk. You'd have to put about 8 floppy disks in to get to something beyond the DOS prompt. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, it's just remarkable. Now my son's going to be growing up with AI. It's just so different, and how fast it's this acceleration of culture, which is really interesting. But I've always adopted it. Like, I liked it. Like, when e-commerce came around, we were immediately like, woo, this is fun, what we can do with it. And we got a technology loan and built a website and paid for itself within 3 months. And it was like, whoa, what's this? And then that's how the retail model for us started really early. But I was primarily a wholesaler because it was like, you didn't have the opportunity to reach the end consumer. You had to rely on the stores. Mm-hmm. So that's why I've been a wholesaler for the past 22 years. And the wholesale relationships I have now are based on long-term relationships. They're marketing relationships as well, because it still allows me to reach consumers I can't reach on the internet or through my stores. Had I had the opportunity to start direct to consumer, I probably would have. I mean, I think it's a really interesting space because you can tell your story directly in a voice that you want and you can control. That's transparent and authentic. When you are a wholesaler, you rely on people to tell that story for you. So part of the relationship choices I have are because I feel like people tell that story right. That resonates with me as an artist.
How much of that story is informed by your 2 retail locations? And what is it? What are the challenges of in addition to being a designer who has wholesale accounts, also being a shopkeeper with 2 stores 3,000 miles apart?
Yeah, thanks, Delta. It's That's an interesting question. I've never been one to make easy choices. The reason why we still have Berkeley is I started my business in Berkeley committed to creating that community. And when I decided to move here, I couldn't uproot all those people and I couldn't take away their jobs. I just didn't feel right doing that. So I left Berkeley. But continue to visit it and manage it so that we can keep that space alive and well for those people. Were I a different person and didn't care about people as much, maybe it would be here, all in New York. That's not something I consider lightly. So as challenging as it is and disruptive sometimes to go back and forth, it's, again, part of the brand ethos. In terms of is it challenging to tell that across the two stores? No, because it's about those people. And when we create those relationships and I have those people that I rely on and trust, the reason why I do is because we share values. And so they can speak about them the same way I would speak about them. And I'm really lucky to work with the people that I work with. And they, do that in the stores, whether or not I'm there. And it's also, we don't talk, we don't hit someone over the head with it when they come in. It's more like they look around and it's our choice of fixturing and how the stores are put together and the stones we use.
It's very subtle, but it
subtle.
Feels... And hippie is the wrong word. It's I don't know. It feels like a really chic kind of urban version of a Tulum stand. I don't know.
Thank you. Yeah. I love that. I mean, Tulum's a great space. I used to go all the time. Yeah. You have to, and that's one of the hardest things about sustainability, right? It is a luxury concept, because when we talk about the idea that most clothing $15 to $30, it's what people can afford. Yeah. I mean, when people are thinking about where's their water coming from, their food coming from, how are they going to pay their electric bill, their phone bill, any of those kind of things, they don't have that disposable income to make a better choice about their raw materials. And that's where I think it is a responsibility from a luxury standpoint, is to make better decisions so they trickle down. And then as those materials become more available, the hope is if the demand for them comes up, there'll be more, and eventually price will become less of an issue. And we have to switch. I'm headed to the UN later this afternoon for a convening on sustainability. I mean, the idea that raw material resources are just going to cease to exist because we no longer have the water or the space or the sunlight to grow them, or it's too hot or too cold and we're going to have food shortages. How are we going to be growing cotton? These are really compelling issues, but they're scary. So yeah. A lot of people don't want to talk about them or face them. So you can't hit them over the head with it. Yeah. You got to just start the conversation.
Do you feel that we're being pushed in a good way, really, by this younger generation who is forcing that conversation with some of their choices? I know still plenty of Gen Z and millennials are buying Zara and H&M, not to point fingers
at. Yeah, I mean, they're doing better than they ever have.
Right. But what's doing better and is projected to continue to do well is a lot of repurposed clothing options. We were talking before we started shooting about certain repurposed brands. I'm doing some work with the Goodwill with a couple of designers for William Good to try to activate the huge inventory of gently used clothes that they have. And so you do see them pushing the conversation, hopefully more and more financially. But do you feel that they're the best ones to be pushing it? I mean, obviously at those ages, they're not the most educated. Just the most educated avatar of that issue. And you do find amongst our generation and older generations a little bit of whether it's denial or it's just a scary conversation to have.
Well, I think what you're talking about is huge for many reasons. One, okay, there's a boatload of greenwashing going on, right? So millennials are really susceptible to marketing and advertising. So there's a lot of transparent pricing models that everybody loves. But how transparent are they if they're lying about how much it costs to make something in the first place? So there's that issue, which is a big one. So that's a challenge. But what's even more challenging is I think some of the older generations are scared because they don't want to give anything up. Let's be really honest, right? So I make choices as a small company to pay my employees well. If bigger companies made choices to make things onshore and to pay their employees well, they'd have more money to buy better product. So if
Employees.
employees. So if we're talking about large corporations trying to maximize their bottom line by paying people minimum wage, or like getting upset when we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. $15 an hour? Are you kidding me? That's nothing. How do we expect people, millennials, young kids with smaller budgets, to be able to buy better things? We're forcing them into these choices of Zara or reused culture because other people are amassing wealth, and the disparity between the haves and have not is just growing and continues to grow. And it's, we have to, there's almost, activist is a word, right? Revolution. I don't know. I just think that we're in a really dangerous space where we're not sharing resources and we're taking away people's choices and forcing them to make bad ones. And if we continue to do that, we're all going to suffer.
I have found that the Gen Z, the millennial population, certainly is forcing the conversation of environmental impact and the potential for true horrific Armageddon. Whether they're doing that commercially through their buying behavior perhaps remains to be seen. There are offerings out there that are repurposed and repackaged used clothing that are becoming very viable and branded. But you still see that segment buying from H&M, buying from Zara. You also see our generation and older generations, baby boomers, who have a lot, right, and want to hold on to what they have. Somewhat potentially greenwashing the conversation through big business. H&M has every brand has a environmental component to their story and messaging now. Your thoughts on that in general, and your thoughts on activating that Gen Z millennial consumer in the right way?
Yeah, that's a good one, and it's a big one. We talk about education. Maybe they're not the most educated. I'm going to push back on that a little bit because some of the most educated people are the ones who are manipulating the conversation. Because they're doing it for personal gain. So I'm just happy someone's pushing the conversation forward. I mean, someone has to, because I don't think there's any, the fact that we're heading towards the possibility of a green Armageddon and that a lack of natural resources, food, of mass, look at what's happening in Venezuela, like, more than 2 million migrants walking out on foot. Mm-hmm. And even if you look at aerial views, it's not necessarily just geopolitical. There's deserts exist that didn't exist previously. There's no food. So these things are happening, and people don't want to admit it because it's really scary, but we have to start the conversation, and we have to move forward, and we have to have better choices. So if we talk about these young kids, they want this, but they're still buying from Zara and H&M, we're complicit in that because the people who that you mentioned, don't want to let go of things are the people who are paying those kids. Mm-hmm. They're coming out of jobs. They're coming out of school without the opportunity to get jobs. A lot of them said, or if they're getting jobs, they're not high-paying jobs. I mean, $15 for a minimum hour, when people fight back about that, $15, it's ridiculous. Right. What do you expect people to buy? What are they able to buy? So it's kind of like, it's a cultural issue. It's really about how do we share resources, and those resources are also money. Like, how do we trickle down more funds for people to make better choices? How do we look at who we are as consumers and our economic policies and make a more equitable space, and not get fought back and say, oh, you're being a socialist, or you're a communist, or you're too radical. This is about survival. It's literally about survival. We're arguing about clothing, like but what's going to happen when it comes to the food? Yeah. By 2050, we need to grow something like double the food that we have now. How are we going to do it? European countries are doing a lot of the technological research and developing abilities to do that. But are we in the U.S.? No, we're still giving subsidies for political reasons, and it's an interesting.
Well, and you're
I
right.
can go on forever too.
I know the stratification. This wide chasm between haves and have-nots,
which is bigger than it's ever been.
Exactly, has that kind of insidious offshoot, which the have-nots simply can't afford to care about some of these things because they're struggling to survive.
Correct.
And the people who have, sure, they may be spending very responsibly because they can afford to buy sustainable luxury products, and making luxury products sustainable, as we started with. I mean, jewelry, fine jewelry, very sustainable once made because it's going to last.
But it's also supporting a company that pays people. So it pays people who can go out in the world and have a better life for themselves and their children and have health insurance and have a future, right? So it's those choices. Like when we look at transparency and pricing, sometimes when we make jewelry, if it's not a super high-end product, one of the most expensive components of our cost of goods is the labor, the landed labor. And that's what's the uphill battle, is that challenge is I'm competing with people who make their stuff in Bangladesh and Mexico and China, where labor is, it's not even close to the most expensive component.
And those are the apparel hotspots as well. Certainly Bangladesh and Pakistan, Vietnam, and there have been efforts, but those efforts require, perhaps your conversations at the UN today will touch on that, because there are advisory groups who are monitoring factory conditions and living conditions, because what most people don't know is the factory workers actually live at the factory. It's like flashing back to a gold mining camp in 1849 in San Francisco.
And people in the States get mad when all the Chinese factories close for 3 or 4 weeks. Well, what's that? That's the only time that those people get to see their families. They leave the factories and they go home and spend time. And then like, what way, we can't make clothes? It's like, come on. We all just have to start thinking differently.
Well, I will pivot a little bit out of that dark cul-de-sac.
Too dark.
Bridal.
Yes, the light.
Bridal. Always a big part of a luxury business's
Correct.
portfolio of revenues, of income. How do you touch on it? Do you do wedding bands, wedding items, and what are you seeing in that industry? Since I think you do a bit of that is bringing even more efficiency into it with respect to your ability to interact with those customers who are at that life moment.
Yeah, it's for our retail, it's the biggest part of our business, and I don't do it at wholesale. For the longest time, I didn't want to get into it because it's a conditioned market behavior, that this idea we should all spend 2 months' salary on a ring, and it should be this perfect white graded diamond, and it's a status symbol. For me,
for the guy who's been married and divorced twice, it's just a pain point.
Yeah. Well, maybe the third time is the charm. There's a whole pushback on that now, which is really interesting. I actually started by making men's bands, because in California, you could have a ceremony for same-sex couples way before it was legal. And I had some friends who were getting, married, for lack of a better word, and I started making rings for them. And then it just became kind of word of mouth, and started making some other things. And I was really afraid of the bridal industry and what it represented. And then just realized I could do it my own way, and really started using and looking at alternative stones, responsibly sourced stones. I buy my diamonds from only one person who is willing to put on paper, and that they're transparently sourced and cut and mined. And my customers are really cool. They're really interesting people. The way they come to us is because they research wedding jewelry. They research, what it means. The stats are crazy. Supposedly men will look at 60 brands online before they pick 12 to visit in person, and then
Wow.
then they define from the 12. Women are more like they like what they like and it looks good, and then the fusion of that from a bridal perspective has been really interesting to watch. Is that even from the female perspective of choosing a better product, right? That they want the responsible source diamond, they want the recycled metal, they want it made on shore, they want transparency on where it's made, and we check all those boxes, and then luckily enough the design resonates with them. And they're really cool. They come into the store and they come for multiple visits, and we have lots of talks, and they end up in like this conversation much bigger than just about jewelry. And then they keep coming back, and we see them, and they send us pictures of like one guy did a surprising proposal in Central Park, and with a bunch of friends that just came out of the trees, and this one, it's just like all these great stories. And to be able to mark someone's occasion like that, and to be something that they're going to love and be that heirloom that's going to pass down, as an artist, I really couldn't ask for more. To play that part in someone's life is really remarkable. And it's just really remarkable that those customers are the people that are pushing this conversation forward, who want to be participants in this, and who want the world to be a better place for the choices they make as consumers.
Yeah, it's certainly a life moment, and if a couple feels that way, that's a great way to also cement the pact.
Yeah.
Unisex offerings. I mean, jewelry does have almost an inherent component of being unisex, although I know sizing can vary. I have worn many of your pieces. Today, I will flash some up in images if you're watching on YouTube. But really lovely pieces, and I think they were made with no particular sex in mind.
Except for your cufflinks.
Except for my cufflinks, yes, true.
Well, I was hoping that Ellen might come in and get one, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think women in tailored clothing and crisp white shirts are
one of my favorites, too.
Yeah, no, it's a great look. But what do you think about it more broadly considered? In apparel and jewelry and other, there are a lot of now unisex offerings, brands that are really planting a flag that we are unisex. We are not even going to designate any of our items as for a man, for a woman. Everything is unisex.
Well, we've actually really kind of always felt that way. Like when someone comes into our store and wants to know, is this for ladies or men? It's kind of always been like, well, it's for both. It's for whoever it resonates with, with, the cultural momentum towards recognizing many different genders and identities. I think it's a natural progression for adornment, and that it can welcome anyone. I mean, a lot of times, I have a great social media team, and Dan, who runs my social media, takes amazing pictures of him, all of the rings that he wears, and his hands look beautiful, and people always just assume that it's a woman, and it's like, no, Dan's got great hands, and he wears our jewelry well, and his nail, I mean, I love the idea that we can embrace everyone, and that, unlike clothing, that it's sized, or jewelry can fit. It just can, and that's what's, for me, what I love about jewelry is it's always been this kind of tribal classification, where you come from, what you believe in, and sorry, I keep clicking my rings, and you wear these things to align with something. So it's neat to be able to reach more people, and I love that men now also feel like they can wear jewelry without being judged. I mean, there's a progression in culture of that as well, without it just being the watch matching the wedding band. Like, you can wear a lot more. You know?
Well, so maybe a more ephemeral question, but do you have thoughts on the difference between fashion and style?
I do. That's really an interesting question. I think style is ingrained, and fashion is, what's the word I want to use? Fashion can be a mask, maybe, or it's something that it's an artifice, right? You can buy into fashion, you can be shown what it is to be fashionable, but style is something that's part of you. You don't need to buy a label to be stylish. Whereas I think in fashion, you want to be current, you want to wear the right designer, the right shoes, but style is just part of who you are.
Well, it's really time for your 4W questions.
Okay.
We're talking fashion and style. So, who, what, where, why, when.
Okay. Lots of
Wait a minute,
W's.
That's too many W's. There's actually 5 W's. and I
There's
only have
5.
4,
Wow.
yeah.
Okay.
So mine are what, who, when, and why.
Okay.
And the what and perhaps the who I'll allow you to answer at the same time. What items are you wearing? And this is really for our listeners who aren't watching on YouTube. What are you wearing and who designed it? Which brands designed it?
From jewelry, most of it is me. Although I
Can you throw your hands up just so the camera can
Throw
capture
our
some of
hands up.
your beautiful elegance there?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, some of it in my horrible nails. I do have some of my dear friends' jewelry. We always think fashion's so competitive, but I think a lot of times that's by the people around. The actual designers themselves can be very close. So I have on Polly Wales and Lauren Wolf, who are 2 designers that I love and admire and have a long relationship with. I'm wearing my Year of the Pig bracelet that my partner and I got on.
Are they prayer beads or just
It's
Year
just,
of the Pig?
it's just
Someone got me these, but didn't describe them as Year of the Pig.
well, they're just New Year's bracelets
Yeah.
that we got in Chinatown. So
Yeah.
I'm saying the Year of the Pig. They're just wood. They're cool.
Yeah.
I like them because I just love texture.
They bring a wonderful texture to the gold.
Yeah.
I mean, brown
I am
gold.
wearing the infamous Cartier Love bracelet,
I see that.
which is interesting because my parents got it for me on my 40th birthday.
Okay.
My parents have been split up for a really long time and can never figure out how to do anything together, especially from a loving place. So that they came together to buy me a love bracelet is pretty special. So I've never taken it off since
Right.
I got it.
And the love bracelet is a great concept, right?
It
I
is.
mean, you can admit to that. Even
Oh
the
my God,
Cartier
it's
is of course mass and and highly luxurious, but it's a beautiful concept.
It really is, and it's a very well designed.
For the
piece.
listeners, the small sliver of listeners who don't know what a love bracelet represents and how it's affixed, can you just
It's
educate them?
basically a precious handcuff. I mean, it's a thick piece. It's gold that has a lock, so it doesn't come off easily. The idea, I think, that love shouldn't either.
Yeah.
So that's from a jewelry perspective. From a clothing perspective, I'm wearing vintage Dries and Van Noten, and oh God, he used to have a store in Tribeca. Gary Graham, loved
Okay.
him.
Oh wow. Yeah. Yeah.
Loved Gary stuff.
Absolutely wonderful knits and just a really great design perspective. Yeah.
Also, just such a cool dude. The first time I met him was post 9/11, and we were all doing a trade show called The Workshop, which doesn't exist anymore. And for his headshot, he got a friend of his to do his makeup to look like he'd gotten completely beat up. And that was his picture in the portfolio. And I just was like, I have to know this person. Like,
Right.
how awesome, talk about style, is like,
Right.
here's this great headshot, but I'm going to look like I just got beat up.
Right,
It's just
right.
this, such a great. And then I have on Nikes.
Nikes.
Yeah,
Okay.
old Air Force Ones.
And so, when is really the question of seasonality? To the extent any of these items are seasonal, are they all fall winter? Do you have anything on that's spring summer? Do you have any seasonless items on?
Well, all my jewelry is seasonless.
Right.
I think my Gary Graham T-shirt is seasonless. I mean, from a who, what, where perspective, it was when he still had a brand.
Yeah.
Dries to me is just you can wear it anytime, whenever you want, which is why I love it,
Mm-hmm.
and also something you don't get rid of. So from buying something that's well made that can last.
Right.
And then I've had these shoes since before I had my child, so they're 4 years old. These are my winter boots
They're
because I
great.
don't wear boots.
They're high top Jordans. I'm not a complete sneakerhead, so I can't say exactly.
I'm all
what.
about the sneakers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. You were saying you're selling most of your high heels
Yeah.
or other shoe collection to default to sneakers. And how about the why? So you're coming in here today. You're also headed to the UN. Why this particular ensemble today?
Well, I just came off 2 weeks of market, so most of my other stuff's in dry cleaning. But I mean, these are go-tos for me. It's snowy, it's slushy outside, so
Right.
like I said, my Air Force Ones are like my
we're
snow boots.
mid-February and we're after 2-3 inches of snow last night.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a mess out there.
Yeah. And I had a couple of mezcal margaritas last night, so it was like throw on something easy, all black, and
Right.
good to go.
Right. Is black a default for you, or do you don color from time to time?
I'll wear color in the summer sometimes, but for me, my color usually comes from the jewelry, or the sneakers. So it's usually black, gray, blue.
And is there, in the laws of style, I talk about a lot of different laws that...
You've helped me with some of them. Thank you.
Very welcome. That really govern, how someone in my chair is best advised to present themselves, which is to say a white-collar professional who's a service provider for others. And some safe defaults, but also some safe extensions of self within style that can be explored. You obviously have much more latitude in how you present yourself, but I'm curious because going before the UN, that is a fairly formal affair. It's one of my favorite buildings and complexes in the city as well. I always sort of go a little retro, kind of mid-century if I'm going there. Not that I go there often.
Yeah.
But any way in particular that you present yourself somewhat consistently that you think best shows you as a founder, as someone who's serious about sustainability?
No, I think I just always am authentically myself. And I think maybe that stands out in a room. So what you're talking about is this idea of buying into how we're supposed to look in order to be perceived a certain way is I'm going to walk in being me. And that in itself might stand out as some little form of, activism in a space that then makes people be like, oh, wait, she's got on Air Jordans at the UN. Like, what is that?
Right.
But I also think that aside from you and I, a lot of people don't even notice. So we're in fashion, we're in style, but, and to be honest, I didn't even think about it that way. I just put on what I wanted to wear today and just walked out the door for the day.
Well, you know what people do notice? Because I would agree with that. Most people don't notice exactly what you're wearing, let alone brands or seasonality. What they undoubtedly notice is your confidence and your bearing. And when you feel that you have dressed authentically you and you feel good about what you're in, that's enhanced, I think.
I totally agree.
So clothes and accessories can do that, even in a way that it's almost a placebo effect, right? Nobody really cares, but this person is kind of beaming in a positive way. And if that's because of the clothes or because you had a great yoga workout in the morning or whatever it is, it's good to do.
I completely agree. And for me, full circle, when we talk about design inspiration, that's where I get it. A lot of it is I'm the person on the subway who's looking at everyone. Like, I just love it. I love to see how people express themselves. Like, growing up and outside of Oakland and spending a lot of time in Oakland, I mean, street style, street fashion, that's where everything starts. And so for me, it's just always interesting to see how people are putting themselves together and the conversation that they're willing to start in the world by how they're, what they put on their bodies.
Well, and that inherent first impression that they know they're going to create, it's going to immediately frame where that conversation starts. And again, for me as a lawyer, I want that conversation to start from a place of comfort, as well as a recognition that this person looks quite capable while looking elegant. I mean, that's what I'm striving for. Maybe not always hitting it, but that's what I'm striving for.
The first thing I said was, I like your purple tie.
Well, thank you.
There's a way to operate within, and I think that's sometimes how you make the biggest change, is operating within the confines, but changing the conversation just slightly, using the same language. So that's what I try to do with my work, using the jewelry, but just choosing different elements and components. But let's have a different conversation with it, rather than it just being about further stratification, showing people how much we can buy. But when we buy, what good can we do? And I think that's one of the most exciting things about the future of consumer goods, is this social entrepreneur piece. Yeah. Well, you certainly typify that. And on the subject of conversations, ours, unfortunately, is at an end. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening in and watching. Thank you for being here.
Of course. Thanks for the great conversation.
And you can follow my musings on Hand of the Law on both Twitter and Instagram. Any social media plugs or other things you are active on that you want to shout out to? Listeners?
We have our website. It's melissajoymanning.com, like Eli and Peyton, the last name, but no relation. And same on social media, Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram. all the ones.
All the big names.
And then the 2 stores. So if you
Yeah.
live in New York, come say hi. If you live in Berkeley, San Francisco, come say hi too.
Thanks so much for coming in.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to The Laws of Style with Douglas Hand. For more information, go to our website at www.hballp.com. And you can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Hand of the Law. Thank you for tuning in, and stay stylish.